Lecture 10. The trade-off between inflation and unemployment. When we use the policy to stabilize the economy, there is the fact that this policy emphasis on aggregate demand always lead to the trade-off between inflation and unemployment. In the fact, we can see that for the expansionary policy, the aggregate demand increase lead to higher price, means inflation, and higher GDP means lower unemployment. So this is the trade-off between inflation and unemployment. So now in this lecture, we try to see in detail the trade-off between inflation and unemployment, and also the cost of the policy. Is it good or bad to implement the policy if we have to face with a trade-off like this? The relation between inflation and unemployment may be inconsistent for different cases. For the first case, when there is demand pull inflation, we have the increase in aggregate demand lead to the increase in the price. So in this case, the inflation is called demand pull inflation. At the same time, GDP increase and lead to the reduction in unemployment. So with the diagram, we can see that the increase in AD bring the economy from point A to point B. And at this point, the relation between inflation and unemployment move from point A to point B. So now together with ISAD model, now we use a new model to show the relation between inflation rate on the vertical axis and unemployment rate on the horizontal axis. So now from the first relation, the trade-off between inflation and unemployment move from point A with no inflation and unemployment is at the natural rate, move to point B, higher inflation and lower unemployment rate. And we combine point A and B. So this line or this curve is the combination to show the relation or the trade-off between inflation and unemployment. And this is called Philip curve, the Philip curve. Another reason to the increase in the price is the cost push inflation. For the cost push inflation, if the cost of production increase, it will lead to the reduction in aggregate supply, and aggregate supply reduced lead to the increase in the price, but lower GDP. And lower GDP will be accompanied with a higher unemployment. So now in the diagram, if we have the cost push inflation, so AS, aggregate supply reduced and shift to the left. And the new equilibrium now is at point C. At point C, GDP is lower, means unemployment is higher than the natural rate at this level. And there is inflation higher than zero. The inflation here may be higher or lower than this point. It's not important. And the important is that either this inflation is lower than P1 at this point C is still on the right to the Phillips curve. And now we will say that the cost-push inflation leads to the shift of Phillips curve, shift to the right, and the trade-off between inflation and unemployment now move to point C, and with the new position of Phillips curve. One more reason for the inflation is expected inflation. When there is expected inflation, so it seems that both the firm and other agents in the economy will expect about the inflation, and they won't have the suitable action to correct their demand and supply. So at the same time, aggregate demand increase and aggregate supply reduce. So this change means we have the changes in both AD and AS. So the change leads to the new equilibrium at point D. And at point D, there is higher price, but the output and unemployment rate still the same. Yeah, the natural rate is at the natural, the unemployment is at the natural rate. So the point D is the long run relation between inflation and unemployment. So now we have the short run trade-off between inflation and unemployment will be described by the short run Phillips curve. And in long run, unemployment is maintained at the natural rate with any level of unemployment with any level of inflation. So we have the long run Phillips curve is vertical like this. So this is the fact for the relation between inflation and unemployment. So now if we look back to this model, we can see that once we use the expansionary policy to increase AD, there won't be inflation, but we can reduce the unemployment. And the relation between inflation and unemployment move from point A to point B. Vice versa, if we use the contractionary policy here, the reduction in aggregate demand will lead to lower inflation, but the increase in unemployment, and we have the movement from point A to another point like this. So this is the trade-off of the policy. It means that all the policymaker should think about the trade-off and decide whether they should or should not use the policy. In this case, the relation of the two variables, inflation and unemployment, is shown with the coefficient epsilon. And this epsilon shows the trade-off coefficient between the two variables. If the epsilon is too high, so it means that the cost of the policy is higher, and the trade-off between inflation and unemployment is more serious. But if the epsilon is smaller, so the trade-off is less serious. And maybe the cost, and it also means that the cost of the policy is not so serious. It's not so costly. So this is one of the important aspect we need to care about when we suggest the policy to stabilize aggregate demand. So this is the end of lecture 10.